They sent out the squad cars all because I was driving a few nails into what was basically a wooden phone booth. The HOA president came charging over, waving her arms like she just spotted a wanted criminal, shouting, "He's building on our lakefront." Trouble is, she didn't bother to check whose land it really was. Things got awkward for her real quick. All I wanted was to put up a small cabana, but turns out, I'd unknowingly set the stage for one of the most ridiculous HOA battles anyone's ever seen. Stick around, because what she pulled next made calling the cops look tame by comparison. And let me know in the comments if your HOA's ever confused a simple barn for a felony in progress. It had started out as a peaceful Saturday. I was working on my little wooden shelter on the farm. The plan was simple: a spot for my horse tour guests to rest, maybe use the bathroom or grab some water. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and I even found myself humming while I worked a sure sign. In hindsight, that trouble was brewing. I run rail rides for city folks who want to spend a day in the countryside. Honest, outdoor work is just the way I like it. I never imagined buying a slice of farmland would suddenly paint me as the neighborhood villain. The calm shattered when sirens cut through the morning air. 3 black and white patrol cars barreled down the dusty farm road, kicking up dirt. I set down my hammer, staring in confusion at what emergency could possibly bring them out here. The cars skidded to a stop, and the officers climbed out, scanning the area like they expected to find a crime scene. Then she appeared, Malara Jensen, sweeping out from behind the patrol cars with the drama of a stage entrance. I'd soon learn she'd anointed herself queen of this little community. She pointed straight at me, her voice loud enough to reach the next farm. "Officers, that man is illegally building on public waterfront land." You'd think I'd been caught dumping toxic waste, not building a shed. The lead officer walked over, eyeing my half-finished structure, clearly trying to figure out why 3 units were needed for a guy with a hammer. "Sir, what exactly are you building?" he asked, politely but puzzled. I brushed the sawdust off my jeans and pulled the folded paperwork from my pocket. "Just a small rest stop cabin on my property for my horse tour business, officer. Nothing fancy." Malara nearly vibrated with fury. "This breaks HOA rules and will ruin property values." She sounded like I was about to open a landfill, not a rest hut with a bathroom and bottled water. The officer carefully read through my papers, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Everything seems in order, sir. You have a purchase agreement and proper permits." I nodded. "Bought this parcel from Farmer Hardwell just last month. Everything's legal." Malara's face darkened to a dangerous shade of red. "I don't care what fake papers he has. I am the HOA president. This affects everyone." She kept repeating the words authority and community, as if she could conjure a police arrest by sheer insistence. Off to the side, I noticed a man keeping his distance, Chuck Jensen, Malara's husband. From his wary posture, it was clear this wasn't his first time witnessing his wife stir up trouble. Other neighbors had drifted out to watch from their porches, no doubt curious about what chaos Malara had brought this time. The officer handed back my papers, his tone calm but firm. "Ma'am, this gentleman has proof he owns the land. If you have further concerns, you'll need to take it up with the county or through your HOA's official process." Malara's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, clearly unaccustomed to being told number. Finally, she turned on her heel, shoes clacking furiously, and stormed off. "This isn't over. The HOA will stop this." The police got back in their cruisers and left, likely relieved to escape the neighborhood soap opera. I stood there staring at my unfinished cabin, wondering what on earth I'd stumbled into. Having lived in apartments all my life, I'd barely known what an HOA even was, let alone how one could think they had power over someone else's farmland. Still puzzling over it, I heard footsteps behind me. Betty Carter, my neighbor, walked over from the next farmhouse. She looked around to be sure Malara wasn't listening before speaking. "You should double-check exactly what you bought from old Hartwell," she said in a low voice, glancing at Malara's house. "The creek that runs between property and Malara may not own what she thinks she owns." She paused, watching as Malara appeared in her window, clearly on the phone and animated. "And she's about to find out you know more than she thinks." Betty's words sent a little chill through me, not out of fear, but because it sounded like this property spat might get far more interesting than I'd imagined. The next morning, I got back to work on the cabin. Birds chirped, the creek murmured nearby, and for a brief moment it felt peaceful again. Cutting boards and measuring walls, I enjoyed the simple satisfaction of building something by hand. But that calm didn't last. Right at 10, as if she'd scheduled it for dramatic effect, Melara appeared on the edge of my land, clipboard and measuring tape in hand. She looked less like someone measuring a shed and more like she was preparing evidence for a courtroom showdown. "I'm collecting documentation of violations for the HOA review," she announced loudly, as though she were speaking at a press conference instead of to one puzzled horse trainer. I paused my work and studied her, genuinely wondering what infractions she thought she could possibly be recording, and what violations would those be. I asked, keeping my voice calm, still hoping this could be settled like reasonable adults. "Unauthorized waterfront construction, environmental impact, no HOA approval," she listed off, scribbling on her clipboard with all the intensity of a detective at a crime scene. Her performance was so exaggerated I almost wanted to applaud it, but I knew sarcasm would only make things worse. So instead, I nodded and went back to my hammering, hoping she'd lose interest and leave. Later that afternoon, I watched as Melara moved from house to house, clutching a stack of bright yellow flyers. She roamed the neighborhood like she was campaigning for office, knocking on doors and holding passionate discussions with anyone who'd open up. Most folks accepted her flyer politely, nodding as she spoke, but I could see the worry spreading across their faces as they read whatever alarmist message she was handing out. Within a few hours, the entire farming community had been covered, and I could feel the tide turning against me before I'd even had a chance to explain my side. Even from a distance, the title on her flyer was clear: "Emergency, cabin construction threatens our creek." The exclamation point was so enormous I could spot it from 50 yards away. That evening, Betty brought me one of the flyers. Reading it felt like stepping into a bizarre alternate reality. Melara had twisted my humble little cabin into an ecological disaster, and the machinga complete with dramatic fonts, exclamation marks, and panicked calls to action. According to her write-up, my small rest-stop cabin posed a critical threat to the creek's ecosystem and demanded urgent intervention to protect our shared natural resource. She even called for a community vote and included a petition for neighbors to sign. What amazed me most wasn't just the tone, it was how official it all looked. Fancy formatting and legal-sounding language made it seem like it came straight from an environmental board rather than an angry neighbor with a clipboard and a personal vendetta. By the next morning, the effect of her flyer campaign was painfully clear. Neighbors who had been friendly only days before now glared at me with suspicion. "Why didn't you get permission first?" demanded one, as though I'd broken some sacred, unspoken rule. "That cabin's ruining our view of the creek," grumbled an author, despite the fact that my structure wasn't anywhere near tall enough to block anyone's sight line. "Permission from who?" I asked honestly, completely baffled. "I own this farmland. I have the paperwork." But they just shook their heads, as if I was pretending not to understand. It dawned on me then how quickly Melara's version of the story had become the truth for Thema, and how little chance I had of correcting it once it spread. Almost overnight, the atmosphere shifted from neighborly to tense. People avoided eye contact, parked to block my driveway, whispered and pointed whenever they thought I wasn't looking. It felt like I'd become a villain in a story I didn't even know was being told. Only Betty still spoke to me openly, and even she had to keep her support quiet, since being seen on my side seemed to carry its own price. Then Chuck Jensen, who had so far stayed in the background, finally stepped forward. He joined his wife's cause, telling a small group of neighbors, "Environmental concerns are Ella, we can't afford to risk property values." Coming from someone who worked at the bank, his words added a sense of credibility to Melara's crusade. When someone who understands loans and mortgages starts warning about financial risk, people listen, even if the so-called danger is a garden shed by the creek. Despite everything, I decided not to fight fire with fire. Even though every instinct in me wanted to argue, to shout, to prove how absurd it all was, I kept working quietly instead. When people confronted me, I simply explained the facts. I owned the land, had the paperwork, and was building a small, legal structure for my business. Oddly enough, this seemed to frustrate Melara even more. Without me yelling back, She couldn't paint me as some hostile outsider trying to bully the neighborhood. I was just a guy building something useful on his own property. By week's end, Malara's tactics had grown even more aggressive. "Tomorrow, I'm calling county enforcement about possible wetlands violations," she declared to anyone who'd listen. "Your little project ends now." The certainty in her voice made it clear she truly believed she could shut me down through official channels. That night, I went home feeling worn out and doubt-matched, like I was fighting a battle I barely understood, against someone who never ran out of energy to keep it going. When I checked my mailbox, though, I found something unexpected: an envelope with no return address. Inside was an old black and white photo of the creek, dated sometime in the 1960s, and a short, handwritten note: "Check what Hardwell really sold you. The creek papers are in the metal box behind the old barn." She doesn't know about the box. The photo showed the creek much as it looked today, but with pencil markings outlining what seemed to be property line as a lines that extended further along the waterway than I would have ever guessed. I stared at the photo, trying to figure out who had sent it and why they trusted me with this clue. The next morning, following the mysterious note's instructions, I drove over to Hardwell's old farm. Though he'd sold me the creekside plot, he still owned the farmhouse and barn a couple miles away. It felt a bit awkward, poking around someone else's property, but the note had been so specific I figured there had to be a good reason. And sure enough, right behind the old barn, exactly as described, I found it: a rusted metal box, sealed tight and probably untouched for decades. A few gentle taps with my hammer were enough to break the lock, and inside, wrapped carefully in plastic, were official documents. The language was old-fashioned, heavy with legal jargon, but the meaning was crystal clear. I owned the entire creek, the creek bed, the water rights, all of it confirmed by a 1962 survey map. Sitting there in the dirt, holding papers older than I was, it hit me. Every time Malara had warned about community waterfront and shared resources, she'd been talking about something that legally belonged to me. All her threats about HOA enforcement and environmental authority over the water meant nothing. The HOA had no say over privately owned water, and the creek was mine. I took careful photos of every page with my phone before heading back to my cabin site, my mind buzzing with what I'd found. The irony was almost funny. Malara was campaigning to stop me from building on my own farmland, supposedly to protect my creek-broken bar from myself. But instead of rushing to confront her, I chose to keep this discovery quiet for the moment, partly because I wanted to see just how far she'd go, and partly because I needed to understand fully what I'd inherited. That afternoon, I stopped by the county office to confirm what I'd found. The clerk looked over the documents, nodded, and said, "Yes, these match our records exactly. You do own the creek bed and water rights, and those are quite valuable, actually." I thanked her and left, now armed with both historical proof and current verification. Meanwhile, Malara's campaign only got louder, with Chuck backing her and talking about lawsuits and falling property values. She gathered real momentum. I watched her car visit house after house that morning, and by afternoon she had collected 12 signatures on a petition demanding I stop construction immediately. Reading it was surreal. It called for protecting our shared waterfront from unauthorized development on land and water that, as it turned out, weren't shared at all. That evening, she went a step further, posting professional-looking notices around the neighborhood announcing an emergency home meeting. Friday, 7 p.m. Stop illegal construction. The posters looked official enough to convince anyone who didn't know better. Later that night, Betty called to warn me. "She's planning something big," she whispered. I heard her at the hardware store ordering a professional sign. "What kind of sign?" I asked. Betty lowered her voice. "Something about a community protection and no building zones. Travis, I think she's about to do something that could make this a lot worse." The next day, I kept working but stayed watchful. I photographed every flyer Malara posted and kept copies of the threats she'd slipped into my mailbox. To my surprise, Betty wasn't my only quiet ally. The mailman started tipping me off too. She had a bunch of official-looking notices printed downtown. He told me, community protection orders, environmental enforcement. Whatever she's planning, it's going to look pretty real. Friday afternoon, just as Betty had warned, The delivery came. A large wooden sign was dropped off at Melara's house. From my cabin site, I watched as she and Chuck inspected it, clearly pleased. Even at a distance, I could see how official it looked. Clean fonts, sturdy construction, exactly the kind of sign that would convince most people it was backed by law. It read, "No building a HOA protected area. Violators will be prosecuted." I could easily guess where they intended to plant it. That evening, Betty called again, voice tense. "They're going to put it up tonight, before you start work in the morning," she said. "She wants it to be a done deal when you show up, so people see it first." I thanked her and spent that night getting ready for what was clearly the next phase of this absurd fight. And I made an important decision. If Melara wanted to play with fake authority and professionally printed signs, I'd make sure there was a record, photos, notes, dates, everything. She was about to hand me the very evidence I'd need to end this once and for all, because now I knew something she didn't. I owned not just the farmland, but the entire creek she claimed to protect, and her growing overconfidence was making her careless. She was claiming community rights over something the HOA had no legal claim to. All I had to do was wait until she overplayed her hand and reveal the truth at exactly the right moment, when her story was at its most convincing. Saturday morning arrived with the inevitable. I pulled up to my cabin site and there it was, the big wooden sign, planted right beside the creek. "No building a HOA protected area. Violators will be prosecuted." Concrete base, crisp lettering, the full appearance of authority, just as I'd expected and exactly as I'd prepared for. It was hard not to be impressed by the sign itself. It was planted deep into the ground with concrete, clearly meant to look permanent and official, placed right where anyone driving by on the main road would see it. For a moment, I had to admire the sheer audacity of Melara's performance. Word spread through the farming community faster than gossip in a small-town diner. Within an hour, neighbors started drifting over, curious to see what all the fuss was about. Some nodded approvingly, others frowned, and many seemed to assume that someone in real authority had finally stepped in to stop my cabin build. A few parents even brought their kids, turning the sign into a lesson about community responsibility and environmental protection. Melara arrived like a triumphant general, clipboard in hand, Chuck close behind, camera ready. Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who completely believed her own story. "Last night's emergency home meeting voted unanimously to protect our creek from unauthorized development," she declared, as if she'd just stepped out of a courtroom with a legal ruling. You'd almost believe a formal session had been held somewhere, rather than her typing up fake minutes in her living room. "This construction poses serious environmental risks to our shared waterfront resource, and the community has spoken clearly about the need for immediate action," she continued. That was when Betty stepped forward. I could see the effort it took for her to challenge Melara openly. "What meeting?" she demanded, her teacher's tone cutting through the morning chatter. "I'm an home member, and I never got notice of any meeting." Melara barely blinked. Her answer was smooth, practiced. "All active members were notified through proper channels," she said, sounding so certain it almost covered the lie. "This was voted on according to established HOA procedures." But some neighbors were starting to look skeptical. "I didn't hear anything about a meeting," said another farmer from down the road. "When exactly did this happen?" In response, Melara produced her printed meeting notes that looked freshly made but were offered like gospel truth. According to those papers, 15 members had attended and unanimously approved a ban on construction within 100 feet of the creek. Chuck then stepped up to add financial weight to her environmental message. "Legal costs from environmental damage could affect everyone's property values," he warned. "My wife just prevented a disaster that could have cost this community thousands in legal fees." The crowd quickly split into predictable camps. Melara's supporters argued that environmental protection was worth some inconvenience. Better to be safe than sorry. Betty's group of longtime residents questioned the sudden paperwork and the legal basis for the HOA's supposed authority. The rest, most of the community, just looked uncomfortably clearly wanting to avoid getting pulled into a messy fight. I stood there quietly and let it play out. Lies backed by confidence can be powerful, but that confidence often melts under careful scrutiny. When neighbors asked me questions, I simply said I owned the farmland and had proper documentation. I kept my tone calm, which seemed to frustrate Melara even more. She couldn't paint me as an aggressive outsider if I wasn't arguing back. Her increasingly dramatic warnings about an environmental disaster started to sound overblown in contrast. As the morning went on, she escalated further. Environmental protection laws support our position completely, she told anyone who'd listen. This construction violates wetlands regulations, and the county will back us up. Some neighbors, well-meaning but worried, urged me to back down. Legal fees could bankrupt you, one said gently. Maybe it's better to walk away before this gets really ugly. I thanked them politely but didn't move my tools or stop my work. That evening, I made an important decision. Instead of reacting to Melara's next move, I'd prepare. I loaded my truck with cameras and recording gear I'd once used for promotional videos of my horse tours. If Melara wanted an audience, I'd make sure there was a permanent record of everything she said and did. Her confidence was making her careless too. She'd begun claiming that the creek itself was community property, something no HOA could legally claim. I knew Ida and I knew it would come back to haunt her. Later that evening, Chuck approached me privately, clearly sent by Melara to deliver a final warning. Look, Travis, legal fees could really hurt you, he said, in a voice that tried to sound reasonable. Environmental lawsuits are expensive, and we have the resources to fight this as long as it takes. Maybe it's best if you just moved your business somewhere else. I looked him in the eye. I understand your concerns, Chuck, I replied calmly. For a second, I saw relief in his face, like he thought I was giving in, but he had no idea what I really understood. The stage was set. Melara was about to celebrate her victory in the most public way she could imagine, and I planned to record every word. By Sunday morning, Melara's confidence had reached new heights. Bright yellow flyers appeared throughout the community. Word spread quickly through the farming community. Melara was organizing a community creek celebration for the following Saturday. The flyer she posted everywhere was professionally done, complete with bright graphics and language about celebrating the successful protection of our waterfront. It thanked everyone for supporting environmental measures and invited the whole community to come enjoy their creek. There'd be food, games, and speeches about solidarity. Reading that flyer felt like watching someone walk blindfolded toward a cliff. I realized Melara was about to give me exactly the evidence I needed to settle this dispute once and for all. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather for an outdoor event, and Melara had clearly spared no expense. It looked less like a neighborhood picnic and more like a campaign rally. Banners, a sound system playing music, tables full of food. The turnout was impressive. Nearly every family from the area showed up, enjoying what felt like a real festival. I kept out of sight, positioning myself with binoculars and multiple cameras to record everything. Crisp video, clear audio, multiple angles covering the creekside and the main speaking area. The conditions were perfect, bright sun, barely any wind. From where I was set up, I could see it all. Melara took the stage in a really just an elevated area by the creek but delivered her speech like a politician. This beautiful waterfront belongs to all of us, she proclaimed, her voice loud and confident. The crowd applauded, clearly moved by her words and convinced by the story she'd been telling. I captured every moment on video. Our community creek, she repeated, gesturing toward the water. This waterfront belongs to us, she declared again, pointing right at the creek bank where my cabin site sat. Our HOA has authority over this area to protect our shared resource from private development, she told a small group afterward, explaining it as if it were an established legal fact. Each claim was delivered with total certainty, and people around her nodded, clapped, and thanked her. Chuck then stepped forward, lending financial credibility to the narrative. Environmental lawsuits could have cost every family here thousands in legal fees and property devaluation, he warned. My wife's leadership prevented a disaster that would have affected all our investments. People listened, relieved that someone seemed to be protecting their interests. Children played by the creek, neighbors enjoyed food and conversation, a scene of genuine community harmony. But it was built on a false story about who owned the waterway they were standing beside. My cameras caught it all. Neighbors thanking Melara for saving our view, praising the HOA's authority, and saying how grateful they were that community interests had come before individual property rights. It was clear these people genuinely believed her. Then Malara announced future plans. "We'll install a community dock," she said proudly, "and charge small access fees to help maintain our creek." That was the moment that made it undeniable. She was planning to collect money from people to access a creek that belonged entirely to me, all while standing on my farmland. After about 2 hours of speeches, applause, and shared food, I decided it was time to end the show. I walked directly into the crowd, carrying my laptop and a USB drive full of all the recordings I'd just made. The effect was immediate. It was like someone had cut the music mid-song. Conversations stopped, kids paused their games, and everyone turned to look. Malara's face went completely white when she realized what was happening. "I need to show everyone something important," I announced, loud enough for the whole gathering to hear. Malara's voice cracked as she tried to stop me. "You're not welcome here. This is a private HOA event." I looked around at the creek, the bank, and the people standing there, and then I answered with the simplest truth, spoken calmly, "Actually, Malara, this is all happening on my farm property." The reaction from the crowd was instant: gasps, confused murmurs, and the first signs of doubt in faces that had, until moments before, been so sure. It was obvious now, this situation wasn't what anyone had been told. The moment of truth had arrived, and I had everything I needed to show the community exactly who owned Wata and who had been lying to them for weeks. I set my laptop on one of the picnic tables, and the crowd gathered around, drawn by that uneasy curiosity people get when they sense something important and probably unpleasant is about to be revealed. The festive atmosphere from earlier vanished, replaced by a tension so sharp you could feel it. I connected portable speakers to my laptop and pulled out a folder of documents I'd kept secret until now, waiting for the exact moment when Malara's fake authority was at its peak, and she had the crowd fully behind her. Then I arranged 3 large poster boards on the table where everyone could see. The first board displayed copies of my legal property papers under the heading, "Legal Property Ownership Includes Entire Creek." The second board showed the 1962 survey map labeled, "Original Property Boundaries, Water Ownership Confirmed." The third board had documents exposing the fake home meeting under, "Emergency Meeting, No Real Vote Recorded." The effect was immediate and devastating. You could see the realization on people's faces, like watching someone's worldview crack in real time. I opened my laptop and began playing the recordings I'd made of Malara's speeches. Through the speakers, the crowd heard her own voice declaring, "This creek belongs to all of us." At the same time, they could see my legal property papers proving the creek was entirely mine. "Our community waterfront," her recorded voice said again, as the survey map clearly showed private ownership stretching across the creek bank. Betty, calm and direct, spoke first. "None of us ever got meeting notices." The local mailman nodded in agreement. "Nothing official was ever sent." That was all it took. The fake meeting that supposedly justified halting my cabin project fell apart under basic scrutiny. "I didn't just buy the farmland," I explained. "I bought the creek too. Survey maps, legal titles, county stamps, if they all confirm this isn't community property. It's mine." I pointed to the official county seals, making it undeniable. "I bought this land legally from someone who had every right to sell it, and the sale included the entire creek that you've been told belongs to the community." Faces in the crowd changed from confusion to anger as they absorbed what that meant. Malara tried to save herself, yelling, "Forgery!" But the evidence was too clear and no one listened. "I've been protecting this community for years," she shouted desperately. But people weren't hearing protection anymore. Yeah, they were hearing manipulation. The trust she built vanished almost instantly. "You lied to us," said one neighbor who had been among her most vocal supporters. "We turned against an innocent man because of your lies," another muttered, shaking his head. "How many other HOA decisions were faked too?" someone else demanded. Questions spread through the crowd, questions about what else Malara might have controlled through deception. Chuck, seeing the tide turn, quietly backed away from his wife. "I didn't know the meeting was fake," he mumbled, but it rang hollow, considering how he'd backed her up with financial threats. I watched him walk to his car, leaving Laura standing alone, realizing their marriage might not survive this either. Then Betty stepped forward, with the steady authority of someone used to facing a noisy classroom. "We need to remove the current HOA leadership immediately," she said. "This level of deception can't continue." Neighbors agreed almost instantly, calling for a vote of no confidence. "She has to go." The transformation was swift and absolute. A few people walked over to the fake no building sign Laura had put up, and pulled it right out of the ground. Others joined in, and the concrete base hit the dirt with a loud thud, a sound that felt like the final collapse of her fake authority. Children, who had been quietly watching, actually cheered when the sign toppled, and understanding at least that something unfair had been overturned. Laura's final breakdown was messy and public. She stormed away toward her house, shouting threats about lawsuits and slander that nobody believed. The crowd watched her go with a mixture of embarrassment and disappointment, ashamed they'd trusted her so completely. After she was gone, neighbors turned to me, faces full of regret and apology. "We're sorry we believed her," someone said. "You had every right to build," another added. "How can we make this right?" I answered honestly and calmly. I understood why they'd been deceived and held no hard feelings. They'd simply trusted the wrong person. Right there, on the spot, the community voted to remove Laura as HOA president, dissolve the current board, and appoint Betty as interim leader. They also decided to reinvestigate other HOA decisions from recent years, wondering what else had been built on lies. The shift from Laura's victory celebration to a community uprising took less than an hour, and as I packed up my equipment and documents, I couldn't help but smile at how quickly the truth could dismantle weeks of carefully crafted deception when it was backed by simple facts and shown clearly to people willing to see. The poetic justice of it all was undeniable. Laura had planned this celebration to mark her triumph over me, but instead, she built the perfect stage for her own downfall. Sometimes the most effective way to defeat a liar is simply to let them keep talking until their own words become the rope. By the next morning, the change in the community was visible and immediate. A for sale sign appeared in Laura's front yard before most neighbors had even finished their morning coffee. No one was surprised she decided to leave, but the speed of her departure spoke volumes about how thoroughly her reputation had been destroyed. Later that morning, Chuck approached me, looking worn out and ashamed. "I'm filing for divorce," he told me quietly. "I should have stopped her years ago. When I first realized she was inventing HOA rules and fake violations, I was too much of a coward to confront her, and I'm sorry you had to pay the price for that." Meanwhile, Betty wasted no time restoring real governance. She led the creation of a transparent HOA structure, monthly meetings with published agendas, properly recorded votes, and minutes sent to every member. The board's first official act was to issue me a formal apology for the harassment I'd endured, and a commitment to respect property rights and prevent any future overreach like Laura's. My cabin project, once stalled by conflict, resumed this time with enthusiastic support from neighbors. The same people who had pressured me to quit days earlier now showed up with tools, wood, and food, competing to see who could help most. Building the cabin became a shared effort that brought neighbors closer together in a way Laura's manufactured crises never had. Within 2 weeks, the cabin stood finished. It was simple, functional, and fit naturally into the landscape exactly as I'd intended. It offered a rest stop for horse tour guests, with a small bathroom, water station, and covered seating where people could enjoy the creek view before heading back to the stables. As promised, I kept creek access open under straightforward, fair rules: no littering, quiet after 8 p.m., and shared upkeep. It turned out that when everyone acted in good faith, shared resources could be managed easily without power plays or fake authority. The celebration we held when the cabin opened was a striking contrast to Laura's hollow victory party. This time, the joy felt really rooted in shared work, genuine relationships, and honest accomplishment. My horse tour business grew naturally, fueled by word of mouth from neighbors who had become true friends. Betty's steady leadership brought stability and common sense to HOA governance, with decisions guided by actual community needs instead of personal vendettas. Property values remained stable, and the removal of constant conflict made the area more appealing to new families looking for peaceful rural living. Chuck, After finalizing his divorce, stayed in the community and slowly rebuilt trust. Using his financial skills for good, he helped with budgeting and planning, showing how the same knowledge that once fueled intimidation could be used constructively. 6 months after the cabin opened, the transformation was remarkable. The farming community had become the kind of place people dreamed of when they moved to the countryside, calm, welcoming, and united by cooperation instead of controlled by fear. Property values rose modestly, thanks to genuine amenities and an improved reputation. New families arrived, drawn by stories of neighbors who solved problems together rather than manufactured drama. My horse tour business thrived, as visitors came not just for the scenery, but for the genuine sense of community they felt here. Looking back, I realized I'd learned something vital: patience, documentation, and timing matter far more than anger when confronting bullies who hide behind fake authority. Malara's downfall didn't come from shouting Machessa, it came from simply showing the truth, calmly and at the right moment, when her lies had reached their peak. And so the story ends as it began, me working quietly beside the creek, only now, with a community that values truth over manipulation, cooperation over control, and real leadership over empty bluster. In the end, the quietest voice often owns the massa, while the loudest voice owns nothing but the consequences of its own dishonesty. And every time I see families laughing by the creek that almost became the center of a pointless battle, I'm reminded, truth doesn't need to shout, it only needs to wait for the right moment to speak. From all of us here at Ja Stories, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, leave a comment, and join us again for more unbelievable stories.